Welcome to the Old Man of the Three Things with JJ Redick and Tim Legler. Tim, one housekeeping note. We did not name and number the episodes of the Old Man of the Three Things for last year. So we started numbering them earlier this fall. This happens to be officially episode 200 of the Old Man of the Three. Just a momentous occasion. We haven't been canceled yet, which is fantastic. We've had you on now for a number of episodes, so I'm just happy you get to be part of episode 200.
This is true. Actually, I would expect maybe balloons to be falling down, or like I get something. I remember when I had my 100th stay at the DoubleTree in Bristol, Connecticut, across from ESPN's campus. I got a couple nights in the presidential suite. So do I get anything for this being the 200th episode? And I'm the guest.
I'm going to use the Don Draper line that he gave to Peggy. That's what the money is for, Tim.
Excellent. That's well played. Well played.
All right, let's get into this. Tim, I thought it'd be interesting. We were going to cover this on the last episode, the Old Man of the Three, that we had you on around Christmas, and we just didn't have time to get to it. But I wanted to talk about the bad teams in the NBA and our personal experiences playing on bad teams. So right now, there are 4 teams with a net rating over -10. And I think in NBA history, there's only been a couple of times where there's been 2 teams. And right now, the Spurs, the Pistons, the Hornets, and the Wizards, all with a -10 or higher plus-minus net rating. These teams are objectively bad. They're bad teams. Spurs with 5 wins, Pistons with 3 wins. Look, I don't know that either team sets the all-time record for most losses, but you played on a team in 1993-1994, the Dallas Mavericks, that went 13-69. Real quick, you guys started 1-3, then you went on a 20-game losing streak to go 1-23. You won a game, then you had a 16-game losing streak. You were 2-39 at the halfway point. You were 8-46, and then you had a 17-game losing streak. Now, you won your 9th game. There's 10 games to go. You've tied the all-time record. I want to know what those last 10 games were like. What was the dialogue in the locker room as you guys had these incredibly long losing streaks and truthfully were in danger of setting the all-time record?
Well, all right. So this is interesting going back to this time in my life, because it was like, I did 3 years laying on a psychiatrist's couch to forget about all this. Money well spent, by the way, to get rid of the PTSD from it. But so it's interesting when you're on a team that bad, and we were the youngest team in the league. And so we had some young guys that were still trying to get their feet wet in the NBA. We did have some lottery picks on that team, though. And we had one veteran player that everybody looked up to, in Derek Harper, who was our starting point guard. And by that time, because he played on a team that went to the Western Conference Finals, and now here he is a few years later, and this is the worst team in the NBA. He eventually gets moved out. But as the years going on, JJ, you start off, obviously, you're losing a ton of games early. You mentioned the way you put it, you went on a 20-game losing streak. I think that's funny. Usually you say went on a winning streak. We endured a 20-game losing streak early in the year. So at that point, you kind of know your season's cooked, and you're really just playing for like personal pride and to try to establish yourself, and the organization's making whatever decisions they are. But here's the thing. You're still kind of showing up every night. It's a little bit lighthearted. You're not very good. And you're just going out there and playing loosey-goosey because you got nothing to lose, until, JJ, you start getting into that territory where you're talking about record-setting ineptitude. Okay, when that starts becoming a topic of conversation with the media and national storylines, you're putting on SportsCenter, they're talking about this every time you lose a game, then it starts to feel a little bit like kind of like panic mode is setting in, because you have a feeling. I mean, you might be on a roster that ends up winning less games than any team in the history of the league. So if you look at that, 8-63 with 11 games to play, we are 1 game short of tying the all-time ineptitude. And then, of course, we win 2 games, we're out of that conversation. And we went, I think, 5-6 in our last 11 games. So we got hot late.
I love that 5 and 6 is being hot.
yeah, 5 and 6, red hot, to avoid infamy. And I do remember the weight once it started to get into that territory, that second long losing streak that we had, that's when you started really worrying and getting concerned that you were going to be part of this team. And it's hard if you're associated with something like that, man. It's going to come up every now and then, and you're going to be associated with that. Your name's on that roster. So I just remember this sense of relief, incredible amount of relief when we got that 10th win. And we didn't have to worry about it. And then we actually won the last 2 games of the year, as I guess everybody was kind of getting ready for the summer. We played extremely loose and free, and we won the last 2 games to get to 13.
There's an interesting dynamic here when you play on a bad team. And I want to get to the competitive aspect of it, the weight of winning and losing in a second. But one of the things that happens, and you touched on this a little bit, is you want to play for the team. You want your team to win. And there's some reality of our team sucks. And then so you have to balance that with your own personal ambitions. And I think to a degree and I'm not saying this is happening in Detroit or San Antonio or any of these places. I'm just speaking of my own personal experience, and I want to get your perspective specifically with that team, where that sort of balance gets out of whack and there's a schism in the locker room and people start playing for themselves. Like, did you feel that? Did you experience that at all on that Mavs team?
Oh, absolutely. Without question. We experienced that. It was brutal. And it's so hard when, you're a player like I was. I always considered myself a guy that, I was always, I worked hard. I was prepared. I had fought at that point to kind of establish myself after being in Europe and being in the CBA. And now the year before that, I joined the Mavs, and now this is year 2. And so I'm still trying to establish what I think I am as an NBA player. But you're used to being a good teammate, playing the right way and making pretty obvious decisions on the court of how you're supposed to play. And that kind of goes out the window. Even practices become chaotic at that point. And it doesn't feel like professional. It feels like you're very much out there for yourself. And look, if you don't adopt some of that mentality as a player yourself, no matter how you've been taught or what you believe in, and all of the things that are your core principles as an athlete, as a player, as a human being, if you can ascribe to all of those things, but if you don't at some point have some of that in you where you're playing for yourself as well, you are going to get swallowed up in this situation. And you're going to be not only on a bad team, you're also going to be a guy that's irrelevant on a bad team because you're not noticed, because you're the one guy that's trying to do things the right way. So there's no question that seeps in. And as the deeper you go into the year, the more it does. And as you get closer toward the end of the season, and when you're like 6 weeks out, and now, so here we are, like early March, and we're still in this period where we don't know if we're going to end up with the worst record in history. And guys are already starting to think about getting to the off season. Some cases, guys know they're not going to be there anymore, whatever. You talk about a relaxed atmosphere, and it just becomes a situation that's really tough, man. You've got to have a little bit of selfishness in you in that situation to continue to go out, because you're not just playing at that point for the Dallas Mavericks. You're playing for the entire league every single time you go on the court, because there's a good chance this entire thing's about to be blown up. And you want to prove to some people what you're capable of doing as a player. So it does go against what you believe in. If you've been raised a certain way and taught and coached a certain way, you have to get away from that a little bit and have a little bit of narcissism in what you're doing in order to survive it and to continue to have a career beyond that season.
We touched on the Pistons earlier this year when they were going through that losing streak, and we brought up the word, I think I said it, you lose a sense of purpose. Because I think the purpose of an NBA basketball season is winning and losing for sure, and then it's also growth. And so you sort of, I found it when I played on the Orlando team the first year after we had fired Stan. We trade away Dwight. We've got a youth movement, but we've still got some vets hanging around from those sort of glory years. I know we didn't win, but those were glory years for the Orlando Magic, and in that run with Stan. We've got me, we've got Turk, we've got Jameer. We brought in Aaron Aflalo. Glenn Davis was on the team as well. So like there was this, we knew the youth movement was coming. We knew they were trying to rebuild through the draft. And there was a real sense, I think, from the vets of like frustration because we were used to things going a certain way. And I remember we started that season 12-13. We win a home game against Washington, but Baby gets hurt. And we went on a 10-game losing streak. We win a game in LA, a day game versus the Clippers, that Lob City team before I got there. Then a few games later, we start another losing streak. We lose 12 in a row, win a home game against Portland. I was traded shortly thereafter. I remember thinking at some point during that first losing streak, because you start 12-13 and you're like, we were supposed to be a lottery team. Maybe there's a chance we can sneak in the playoffs. Management's probably not going to be excited about that, but maybe there's a chance. And then sort of reality sinks in and you almost have to reframe your purpose. And for me, it wasn't about like stats on that team. It was the first year where I felt like I got to play like how I want to play. Jacques Vaughn came to me. He's like, I'm going to run plays for you. All right. You might start some games. You might be, he referenced Manu Ginobili. You might be our Manu sometimes coming off the bench, but the offense is going to run through you. I had the career high in assists that year. So I got to play the way I wanted. So it wasn't for me on that team. It wasn't like, oh, I've got to go out of my way to put up stats, because when I was on the court, like I was very involved in the offense. I reframed the winning and losing part as the growth of me as a player. But more importantly, that year specifically, it was like, how do I become a better leader? And look, there was a couple weeks there where we were losing games and I was not happy. I was ornery day to day. And it was one of the few times in my career where I can say I wasn't the same guy every day, right? So I sort of had to reframe my brain. I had to reframe the purpose. All right, I'm going to really lean into being a leader. I'm going to be a leader for Andrew Nicholson, for Nick Vucevic, for each one more, for Mo Harkless. Like that's what I'm going to, Kyle O'Quinn was on that team too. I'm going to lean into that. And it gave me a sense of purpose. I think something else you said that really sticks out to me is the feeling of irrelevance. That was really the first time in my career where I felt that irrelevance. And I remember specifically Monday of free agency. It's the second day of free agency. I had a sushi dinner in LA with Doc Rivers and my agent and Greg Lawrence. Aaron Tellem was there. And the thing I said to Doc, I was like, you have to make this sign and trade happen. I don't want to be irrelevant. I want to play on a relevant basketball team. And the other teams I was deciding to potentially sign with, I didn't get the sense that they were going to be relevant teams. I didn't get the sense that they were going to be true contenders. And that feeling of irrelevance to me was the big, like not being a part of a team that mattered. That is a different experience. You're on the Boston Celtics. You're on the LA Lakers. You're on the Pistons or the Hornets. Those are two different NBA experiences.
No, it's so true. One of the things I can relate to, and you talk about becoming a better leader. So let me just tell you a couple things about that season, 93-94. First, we have Derek Harper on the team as our only real veteran, proven player at that point. Jimmy Jackson, we had drafted the year before as a lottery pick, and this was a different time when, before you had the rookie scale slotted in. So he held out for most of the season. He didn't join the team the previous year till March. So Jimmy Jackson comes in, plays like the last 6 weeks of the season, plays great. The city thinks that, okay, maybe we have, a franchise type player, a lottery pick. The following year, the 93-94 season that we're talking about, we draft Jamal Mashburn. So now Mash comes in as a high lottery pick, and he clearly was a transcendent offensive talent. You could see that immediately. And we have Derek Harper on the team. There's a little bit of hope at the start of the year, but then the losing starts kicking in right away. And Derek Harper at that point, been around a while, been on good teams, was like, look, and he and Quinn Buckner, who had just been hired to coach that year, they kind of butted heads. And so Derek Harper wants out. We trade him to the Knicks. He goes to the Knicks, and I think the year after they go to the NBA Finals as their starting point guard for Derek Harper. I was so happy for him because he's one of my favorite teammates of all time. And so Harper leaves, and now it's really just a bunch of young guys all in this chaotic situation. A lot of selfishness, I felt like, kicked in. But talk about leadership moment. So we're at practice one day, and the coaching staff is so disgusted with how things are going at practice, I guess the lack of seriousness, they basically leave. Say, you know what, you guys go coach yourselves. We're out. They walk out of the gym, the entire staff. And we're all looking around at each other, and you know what? And the players are like ready to go, like leave. And I'm like losing my mind. Like, no, we're gonna stay here. We're gonna get something done, man. Are you kidding me? You guys, this is embarrassing. Let's play. Let's work. We ended up just playing like basically some really intense pickup basketball, but it felt like it was like the first time that I experienced it in a while. Guys wanted to win. Like it was pickup ball, but that mentality kicked in, and every player who's ever played and got to that level, you know what it feels like to play pickup game. You lose, you got 5 guys waiting, you're not in the next game. Like you want to hold court, and that's what it felt like that day. But it was like I remember I was the one that got very vocal about it. Like, we're not walking out of the gym because the coaches left. We're going to get something done here because I was so sick of losing and sick of the embarrassment and sick of like just the environment that we were in on a daily basis, even with our home crowds. It was crazy. And all the different side stories that happen throughout the year that just things get very bizarre and weird. And you're just trying to survive, JJ, at that point. You're trying to survive, and something better is coming for you. And the one good thing about that year for me was I think people got to see that I could shoot the ball at the level I needed to at the NBA level. I could do that. I could compete at that level athletically. I could do all those things because I think I had some doubters going into that. Probably the year before I really started to prove it, but then that year getting an entire season. So, and I think a lot of guys in that locker room that were playing for themselves kind of felt that way. If they proved something or they didn't, it was really about yourself in a bubble. That's what it felt like the second half of the year. And it's a terrible feeling in a team sport because the best feeling in the world as a basketball player is when all guys are connected and you're playing for the same thing and it's us against the world and everybody in this locker room, like all that matters, like that mentality, very hard to hold on to that when you're losing night after night.
My first year in New Orleans, we started 6-9 and then we had a 13-game losing streak. And during that losing streak, I saw some of the things you're talking about start popping up, right? Body language, individualism, some selfishness. So I go to Alvin Gentry before practice. I'm like, I don't know how long this is going to take, but we're going to meet as a team, just the players. And I don't know your experience with players-only meetings. Sometimes they're productive, sometimes they're not. I can say that was probably the most productive player meeting that I was ever a part of. Drew and I, we sort of led it, but we opened the forum and everybody got to talk. And the end of that season, we end up Zion comes back in January. We end up playing really well all the way up until COVID hits. We're in a position to compete for a playoff spot. We didn't play particularly well in the bubble. But in my exit interview with Alvin Gentry and Chris Finch, this is one of the greatest things a coach has ever said to me. They said, our locker room could easily have been lost. The fact that this season actually turned out to be an enjoyable one with the group is a real testament to you and Drew. And that moment, like, it meant a lot to me. And I don't think I would have been prepared for that moment if it wasn't for that last year in Orlando where I sort of embraced the leadership aspect. Tim, I want to get to, we had a great slate of games. You called it weird when we first got on before we started airing. Great slate of games last night. A lot of movement right now in the standings. A lot of teams in both conferences bunched together. In the Eastern Conference, seeds 4 through 8, all with 15 losses. Orlando, Cleveland, New York with 21 wins. Indy and Miami with 20. And then over in the Western Conference, the Clippers losing to the Lakers last night with 13 losses in 4th place. And Phoenix in 9th place with 17. A number of teams playing, I would say, inconsistently. I want to touch on both conferences, though, and just get your overall sense of the team in the Eastern Conference that you are the most high on in that group between the Knicks, Cleveland, Miami, Indiana, and Orlando.
Man, this is tough because I think there's it's a fine line between the 5 teams you just mentioned: Magic, Cavs, Knicks, Pacers, Heat. I think those 5 teams was a very fine line. I absolutely love the Knicks acquisition of OG Anunoby, and I think their best days are ahead of them. They're 4-0 since they got him. RJ Barrett is a talented offensive player, but he's inconsistent. And I think OG Anunoby he's not a guy that necessarily you're going to have to run things through the way you really did RJ Barrett in order to, I think keep his rhythm, get him going. That's the type of player that he is. OG Anunoby can go long stretches, be super effective without having to have anything run for him, and guard at an elite level, 4 positions on the other end of the floor. So he gives you the top shelf, like all league defensive caliber effort every night on that end. And on the other end, he's a pretty consistent open 3-point shooter. He's a pretty good slasher. And the good thing is he's going to give you very valuable production, even if you're not running anything for him. And that's why I love that trade. I think the Knicks now are going to start to steadily climb. Would not be shocked whatsoever if Knicks end up in the 4 spot in the Eastern Conference. I also think Indiana is a team that is absolutely built for the regular season. They're incredibly difficult to prepare for. The pace at which they come at you and the way they spread you out immediately when they get over half court, and Halliburton's vision and just the way they make you pay, very difficult to prepare for with one day, like a film session and a shoot around. Okay, let's talk about the Pacers. It's very tough. Now you get into a 7-game series, it's a little different. You can start to really lock in on what you need to do to make them just a little bit less efficient. And they're not very good defensively, although they've gotten better. So that's a different story. We'll deal with that when we get there in a 7-game series for the Pacers. But in the regular season, they're going to win a ton of games because the pace is just too much for you to be ready for. It's so different than the way a lot of teams play in this league. So I think Indiana actually has a really good chance as well to continue to climb up. Cleveland's an interesting story. They're 21-15, and you would think the way they've been talked about, JJ, that they've had a horrible year, but they're 6 games over 500. They're sitting in the 5 spot, right? And they're still within striking distance of like the 3 spot. And you feel like they've been a disappointment. But look, they've had some injuries to deal with, and let's see what happens with them. I don't love them as much. I don't know if I feel like I've already seen their ceiling. Maybe that's why. And I still think there's more for Indiana, more for the Knicks, more for the Magic to grab. But I'm looking at the Knicks and Pacers and actually Miami as well. They've been a great story because they just haven't been talked about all year. Yet here they are. And they got a little winning streak recently, had some really good quality wins, particularly on the road. And again, they've dealt with injuries. So I think the Heat's best days are ahead of them. If you want me to flush it out, I think I would go with the New York Knicks or Miami, probably most likely to end up in that 4 spot and host a home series. That's how I feel about it.
Okay. Was hoping we could disagree on this, but we're going to agree. We're going to agree. Let me say this. I'm not hating on any of these teams. I actually really like all 5 of these teams. They're good basketball teams. All 5 of them are. Cleveland's interesting because, they've had a bunch of injuries. Even when they've been whole, they've underperformed, I think, relative to expectations. They had these injuries. They're 18-15. They're sitting, I think, at tied for 8th or 9th, in the East. And then Jared Allen all of a sudden returns to form, and it looks like an all-star player again the last 7 games. 21-16 the last 7. They've won 3 in a row. They're back up, essentially tied for 4th with the Magic. I'm not willing to sell all my Cleveland stock. And I know Mobley and Garland are going to be out for a little bit. I'm not willing to sell my Cleveland stock. I still think, in a potential playoff series, when they're whole with the addition of Max Strus, they're a good basketball team. For me, it is the Knicks. They have been a top 10 offense for most of the season. In the last 4 games since acquiring OG Anunoby, they are the number 2 defense in the league. They really struggled defensively after the Mitchell Robinson injury. I mean, really, they were around top 10 at the time of his injury. They were a bottom 5 team for a number of weeks. OG has completely changed that. You bring up the RJ trade. Look, I said this on air when I called OG's second game, which was the Bulls game in MSG last Wednesday. I think the fit is better. It's not a knock on RJ. You have 2 ball-dominant players in Jalen Brunson and Julius Randle. Jalen Brunson is, I think, 2nd in the NBA in touches this year. Julius Randle is a top 3 ISO player in terms of volume. Those guys have the ball in their hands a ton. RJ Barrett is not a good off-ball player. He's just not. He's not. He's never really found that consistency from 3-point range outside of his second year. OG is a better fit. It's a better fit on this team. They needed a true defensive stopper, a bigger wing. They got that in OG. They needed a guy who can play off the ball in terms of a spot-up shooter. One thing that has always stood out to me about OG, he's always been a great cutter, and we've seen him as a cutter in New York having a lot of success. And I think Brunson and Randall are that good. I do. I think they're that good. The question for me on the Knicks will ultimately be sort of the rotations and the bench production. That Philly game the other night, you saw McBride, you saw Quentin Grimes. If those guys can consistently, at least one of them, give you 10 to 15 points off the bench, this Knicks team has a real chance to be in that number 4 spot. I also want to say Isaiah Hartenstein has been incredible for the New York Knicks, filling in for Mitchell Robinson. The other teams. So I love Orlando. I think Banchero is going to be an all-star this year. I think there's no doubt. He just absolutely controlled and dominated that game last night against the Atlanta Hawks. With Indy, they're one of the most fun teams. Their offense is incredible, all of that stuff. I love your take. They're going to win a lot of games. They're going to be in a position to be in the playoffs. Miami, to me, is sort of the wild card here. I think there's 3 guys on their team that are having career years in Bam, Tyler Hero, and Duncan Robinson. Jaime Jaquez Jr., who we've talked about a ton, has been the 3rd best rookie in the NBA. In terms of efficiency and winning impact, you could argue maybe he's 2B. He's been that good. The question around Jimmy Butler's health and his availability in the regular season, he's missed 7 of the last 8 games. I think that could determine where they land in the Eastern Conference. That's my big question mark with them. A healthy Miami team in the playoffs, nobody fucking wants to see them. Nobody wants to see them.
No, listen, the Heat, it's just amazing to me because I don't know how deep we went into the season now. The Heat have played 35 games. I probably went 25 games before I even mentioned the Miami Heat and all of the stuff that I'm doing, right? All the different platforms I'm talking about. They just weren't coming up because they didn't have a great start to the year. They had guys hurt. And then they start getting hot and they're beating really quality teams. And the way that they're doing it looks different than the way a lot of teams are winning every night. Because if you just look at on a random night, we had recently last Wednesday, right? We had 5 teams score 140 points. We had 10 teams score 130 points that night, right? And there's a lot of 133, 127 games in the NBA right now. And then you look at the Heat and the way that they start to climb the rungs in the ladder in the East, and they're not doing it that way. They're winning games 108, 101, and you're going, okay, see, now this is what like a playoff tested team looks like, because you might have to win some games like that when you get there. And so now all of a sudden, here you are, you're a third of the way into the season, and you're starting to talk about Miami, and I go, look, we know how good Boston's been, and I think that's the best team in the NBA, and they can beat you on both ends of the floor. I think Milwaukee's got some real issues right now defensively. It's glaring how much they have dropped off defensively from the team that won the championship. And I think they've got some real issues in stopping people right now. So I've got some question marks about them. Philadelphia, I think with the way they play now stylistically, with Maxey having the basketball, they just look like they all fit better. There seems like there's more of a bounce and an energy with this team. But do they have enough ultimately to contend with those teams? I look at the Heat, JJ, and I say, man, you said nobody wants them. And I think you mean nobody, as in Boston, Milwaukee, Philly, even the top teams don't want to see the Miami Heat in a 7-game series because of how well coached they are, how hard they're going to make you work. You know that they're never going to beat themselves. They don't like mail it in. They are going to make you earn it and work possession after possession and grind you down. And that's why you don't want to play them. So I look up now and I say, would you be shocked, JJ? Would you be shocked if the Miami Heat ended up in the finals again? I mean, it's not going to be some crazy thing if the Heat end up doing that because of who they are and who coaches them. Now, I wouldn't put money on that. I think Boston ends up in the NBA finals, barring some sort of an injury. But I'm just saying it's not out of the question to think they're in the mix again to return to the NBA finals. And we have barely discussed this team all year.
Absolutely. They beat all 3 of those teams, Milwaukee, Philly, and Boston in the last 2 seasons in the playoffs. There's just a corporate knowledge there. There's a corporate knowledge when it comes to how to win in the playoffs with the Miami Heat. Let's get to this Western Conference lineup of teams. Clippers in 4th, Sac in 5th, Dallas in 6th, New Orleans in 7th, Houston in 8th, Phoenix in 9th. Who out of these teams? I actually have a harder time with the Western Conference, to be honest with you, outside of the Clippers. But who of these teams stands out to you? I think we both are in agreement that we expect, assuming health, the Clippers to ultimately end up as a 3 or 4 seed in the Western Conference. But which of these teams are you willing to sort of bet on?
Yeah, look, the Clippers right now have completely found a great rhythm. Kawhi Leonard's been healthy all year. He looks as dominant as ever, as efficient as ever. They've got the depth. They've got the role players. Zubac's a big night last night. It just continues to impress me to how hard he plays. And again, one of those guys you just love because you don't have to call anything for him, and he still just goes out there and busts his rear end on every single trip, get you extra possessions. Paul George, for the most part, been healthy, playing well. James Harden, I think it's a great lane for him. He doesn't have the pressure on him to be option 1 or option 2, and I think that was a problem for him. I think he would feel some of that pressure, and he played differently. He loses aggressiveness at times. He doesn't have to worry about that as much. He can be more of a facilitator with this group. Look, it's seamless right now since he got there. You can't deny it. And they have the ability, which I don't think a lot of teams do, to be suffocating for a 5-6 minute stretch if that's what they need to do defensively. They have that ability. So the Clippers, to me, are a no-brainer. They stay healthy. Kawhi stays healthy all year. They might end up 3. I don't know if they're going to have a chance to catch Denver or Minnesota, but they could possibly catch the Oklahoma City Thunder. So I think they're going to host a home court in the first round, whether that's a 3 or a 4 seed. The other team to look for right now is the Pelicans. I brought up an interesting question, JJ, and I want to get your take on this because I haven't talked to you about it. When I start talking about all the teams in the league that are like contenders, let's say top 10 teams, they're in that mix. They're clearly upper tier teams. And I ask you about each team, who's their best player? You have a definitive answer. I think within a nanosecond, you're going to give me a name. They're the only team in the mix, the Pelicans, that I don't think you could say that definitively. It should be Zion, but I don't know that Zion plays with that level of urgency every night to be the best player on the floor every night. But it should be him. And I think that concerns me. Some people might think, well, that's a good thing, right? They got balance at the top. McCollum, Ingram, Zion, it could be any one of those guys on a given night. Yeah, well, I don't know. All those other teams, there's a name that'll pop off your tongue immediately when I say who their best player is because there's a standard they're setting every single night. And it doesn't mean they're going to shoot great every night or have great production every night. Most nights, yes, they're going to have some off shooting nights, but the standard they're setting with the relentless pressure they're putting on teams and bringing it every night because the expectations are there. Every other team in that mix, the top 10, has that guy. And that's my only concern for New Orleans. Like, they're playing great right now. It's undeniable. But that, to me, is a question mark about them. And it relates around Zion Williamson for me. I'm curious to get your take on that.
I think you were spot on with your take. And I don't think there is a clear best player. And I love Zion at his best. I love BI. I praise that guy more than anybody, I think, on the Pelicans. I love BI. Last night's a great example. No Zion last night. They play the Kings in Sacramento. Watch that game. When they're at their best, this is why I like refuse to sell any Pelican stock and why I'm still bullish on this team as a contender. And I mean that. When they're at their best, they have big wings. We saw how disruptive they were yesterday with De'Aaron Fox. They have shooting. When they're spaced and moving the basketball like they were last night, they're a really hard team to guard. BI is a playmaker downhill. He had some passes late at the rim, on time, on target to the opposite corner for wide open threes. CJ has sort of now found his he was awesome last night, but he has sort of found where he fits in the pecking order. You're bringing at times, I think he should start, but you're bringing at times Trey Murphy off the bench, who is another big wing that can shoot, that can attack the rim. they have a very, very good roster, a very good roster. There are lineups they can put out where they go super big. They can go super small. They can put in Alvarado to be disruptive. Like, I think within a playoff series, this team at their best is a very tough out against anyone. But I think the big question mark, you nailed it. It's like, what version of Zion are you going to get? And the hierarchy thing is valid because there have been times this year where Willie Green has sat him in crunch time down the stretch. And whether that's just a matchup thing, defensive, whatever it is, like those are decisions being made. Joe Mazzulla's not doing that with Jason Tatum. Mark Dagnall's not doing that with Shea. So I think it's a valid point you make. And the night-to-night urgency and energy from him, it varies. The best version of him is fucking awesome. He's an all-NBA player, the best version of him.
There's no question. And he had a game recently against the Lakers, and he's going up against that Anthony Davis, big front line, and he was incredible. Every time he caught the ball, everything he did was decisive, quick, athletic, powerful bursts, finishing. Like he had a couple plays in that game where he's getting the ball his back to the basket with Anthony Davis on him, who's 7 feet tall, one of the best post defenders in the league. Great length, great timing, and he's just going into like his drop step middle, then spin back and shooting these baby hooks as if Anthony Davis wasn't there. But he did it so quickly and so decisively, and he was so locked in that night. And I was like, if he played that way all the time, and I didn't watch him for periods of games kind of shuffle around and not look like he's energized to play. And look, some of it is just because there's an unselfishness there about him where it doesn't matter to him. I guess sometimes when they get a lead, even he'll kind of play that way. And I go, okay, I played with a guy in Washington, Rasheed Wallace, just his rookie year. I called him the most unselfish superstar talent I've ever seen because he genuinely didn't care. He had won at every level at high school, the best high school team in the country. Then he goes to Carolina on a great team, comes to Washington. All he'd known in his life was winning. It's really all he cared about. And I always felt like this dude could have been perennial all-star every year if that's what he cared about, was putting up numbers. I think there's some of that with Zion. It's not important to him every night, but I think it maybe needs to be more important to him for his team to set that bar because he is their unique force. And the teams that are top teams that expect to win it potentially have a unique force that is a one-off that only they have. That's Zion. As much as I love Brandon Ingram and CJ McCollum, there are other teams that have guys that sort of replicate what they look like and how they play. There's nothing like Zion. There's nothing like Jokic. There's nothing like Embiid. There's nothing quite like Giannis, right? You go up and down the list, and there's really nothing really like Kawhi. And Zion Williamson has the ability to do that, JJ, to separate himself from everybody else as this unique weapon. And when he plays decisively and energized, you see it and you go, wow, how the hell you want to play this team with those three guys and all these great role players that you mentioned? You didn't even get to Valanciunas and Alvarado. They've got so many dudes on this team that contribute every single night in their role. He's the big X factor, and there's a pendulum with him. And if he kept the bar a little higher consistently, I think, man, this team is a legitimate threat in the Western Conference. Like, get out of the West. That's what I would consider them. I'd like to see a little bit more of a consistent stretch out of these things from Zion before I'd really put him in that category and say, okay, yeah, I can see them going toe-to-toe with Denver. And maybe toe-to-toe, they could give him a 6-7 game series. Denver's going to win that series. Zion has the ability to potentially change that. And that's the guy I think has got a big focus on him in the second half of the season because the Pelicans have everything in place to contend if they stay healthy.
The best players in the world every night put their imprint on the game. It's not just about the counting stats. It's the imprint. It's like, this is my identity. This is what makes me great. I'm doing this tonight, and it's going to help my team win. Jokic is a great example of that last night. Guy took 3 shots, but Jamal Murray went off. Jokic has 15 assists or whatever it was. Like, he's going to put his imprint on the game, and it's not always just about scoring. I wanted to get your take right now on the Dallas Mavericks because we got some hate last week saying we were calling Luka underrated because we didn't have him in the top 3 in the MVP. Luka is playing as well as anyone in basketball. That doesn't mean he's the MVP, okay, guys? But they beat the Minnesota Timberwolves last night. Luka and Kyrie both go for over 30. They're a top 10 offense. They've been better than at least I expected defensively. They're 17th right now in defensive rating, sitting at 22 and 15. Kyrie's missed some time. The best version of this team. What's your sort of take on the Dallas Mavericks right now?
Oh man. All right. So they're one of those teams that consistently isn't a great defensive team. They certainly can beat you. Both of those guys playing, they can beat you in a shootout, or even when Kyrie is sat, Luka can win games because of the way he controls it to a certain extent, and the way he can beat you almost by himself offensively because he's that dominant. But they're not great defensively every night. I think they've gotten better. I think their role players are fitting in really well, and Luka's starting to, I think, figure out how to play with some of the new faces that he's got this year. Bottom line is this, JJ. You put them in a close game, you put them in a series that has series-defining moments where it's a 2-1 series and it's a tie game with 4 minutes left, right? It's even you're in a 1-1 series and it's tight late, and they've got those two guys, right? You said the same thing about the Heat. Who the hell wants to play the Heat? Who the hell really wants to play Dallas if you got to get those two guys in a 7-game series when there's going to be tight games and meaningful possessions late? The way that Luka can control the game with his passing or scoring, the way that Kyrie Irving, can go get a basket against anybody, anytime that he wants. I think they're very, very dangerous. I just don't know if when you ultimately get into a 7-game series and you can come up with a game after game adjustment to try to figure out how to defend a team that is that ball dominant with one player, is that going to be enough ultimately, like, to really run through the West and get to the finals with that many quality teams? So I think Dallas is very, very dangerous. They're probably potentially a second round team with a long series in the second round, but I don't know that I'd put them beyond that.
Yeah, 12-5 in clutch games so far, the Dallas Mavericks. Last two teams, real quick. I think what's interesting about the Rockets and Phoenix is the disparity of expectations and performance relative to expectations. I think Phoenix you could probably put in that group along with the Lakers and the Golden State Warriors as underperforming, I think, relative to expectations coming into the season, whereas Houston has overperformed relative to expectations. They've got a top 5 defense. Şengün has been awesome. Dylan Brooks, Fred VanVleet, they've given them balance and leadership. I like this team. I like watching this team. I don't know that they're a team that can win a playoff series right now. And then with Phoenix, look, they're 2-3 now. When the big three play, like last night, they lose to the Memphis Grizzlies without Ja Morant. I just haven't seen enough from them. And this is someone who loves watching Kevin Durant play, loves watching Devin Booker play. Like, I just haven't seen enough from them where right now, 36 games in, I'm not high on them. Now, if there's a 20-game stretch where they have their big three together and they go 14-6, 15-5, whatever it may be, like, we can start, I think, talking about them in the same tier as some of these other teams in the Western Conference. I'm not there yet.
They're the biggest wild card in the NBA because they have the talent at the top of their roster to win the whole thing, and yet here they are, been really impossible to tell what they are because of the inconsistency with which they've played together. I need to see a 15-20 game stretch where all three of those guys are healthy and you get a much better idea. Like, is this a team that's really, really good offensively most nights, but ultimately they don't have enough flow? They don't have a real true leader, a playmaker, a guy that puts his ball on the hip and organizes people. They've got ultimately 3 really good scorers that can score at all 3 platforms, but sometimes you need somebody to just be out there to organize everything and have a flow to your offense. So we need to see that. And I can't make that determination on them. And that's why they're such a wild card, because they could win it all or they could be in the play-in. I mean, think about the range we're talking about with the Phoenix Suns. And so we're going to have to wait and just reserve judgment on them. Houston is a team that's going to be in the mix night after night because of the way they defend. But one thing I'll say about them, and this is a lot like Sacramento last year, Sacramento virtually lost nobody to injury. And they took advantage last year of a void in the West with all these teams were dealing with major injuries to key guys, stars. And so everybody was sort of a mess trying to figure out what they were. We were trying to figure out what these teams were. And then here you go with the Kings. And at one point, their top 7 guys, and this was late in the year, I did the math on it. Their top 7 scorers had missed a total of 17 games. Total. And we're like in the last 20 games of the year. So they were able to, because, hey, just through sheer continuity and having good enough talent, boom, they grabbed the 3 spot in the Western Conference. Houston, if you look, their top guys haven't missed any time. You wonder if it's a matter of time. Maybe some guys start to miss some time. Are they going to be able to withstand that? As good as their defense is and as athletic and long as they are, can they withstand Şengün going out? Can they withstand Van Vliet if he goes out for some time? Are they going to be able to withstand that? Do they have the depth to do that? That's going to be the test for them, because to this point, they've been very, very healthy for the most part. And while other teams have had guys miss time, and so they kind of stay in the mix, far surpassed expectations. I thought this was like a 20-win team coming into the season. Far surpassed expectations. Man. I don't know if they can hold on. Yeah, I didn't think they were very good. I didn't like the roster very much at all. Look, I think, this is a big, statement on Ime Udoka. He's had a big impact on them, and some of their role players have been better than I thought. So, I miscalculated on them. I needed to recalibrate that once I saw them play. But still, let's see if they're able to hold on to where they are, or if you see teams like Phoenix and the Lakers start to get it together. Who knows? Does Golden State at some point have a run in them? Is Houston able to hold on to where they are right now, or do they ultimately end up in sort of a one-off play-in situation to get into the postseason?
Well, it's interesting because a lot of the discourse around the Western Conference was, the top 12 teams are really good, and Houston was not included in those top 12, right? We all had Memphis in there. No one could have predicted how bad they would be without Ja Morant and Tyus Jones. But the Utah Jazz right now, just want to mention them before we go off air, 10-4 in their last 14. Colin Sexton's playing great basketball. I'm calling their game on Wednesday against Denver. Excited to do that in Utah. They're an interesting team too, especially with how the Lakers and Golden State have looked. Maybe they can sneak in to the play-in. Anyways, both conferences, lots going on. Another great conversation, Tim. Always appreciate it. We'll see you in a couple weeks.
Got it, DJ.
All right.